Kia ora, welcome. Who are you? What do you do?
Kia ora, I'm Finn Ross. I think most importantly, I'm an adventurer and just a full-on nature frother. I just love New Zealand, love adventures and being out in the hills. And I guess on these adventures that I've been on through New Zealand, I've seen just the destruction of biodiversity and the devastating impacts of climate change that New Zealand's starting to feel. And I guess that's drawn me to be involved in a bunch of ventures. Lake Hawaii Station, my family farm, we're really trying to explore environmentalism on farm, my PhD in seaweed as a natural climate solution, and then my startup CarbonZ, trading native traceable carbon credits.
Tell us about CarbonZ. What does it actually do?
CarbonZ is New Zealand's first exchange for native, fully traceable carbon credits. We're selling voluntary carbon credits and regulatory carbon credits, equipping landowners with the financial incentive to facilitate restoration on their farms. I think there's this big notion around offsetting globally that it's an excuse for emissions reduction and complacency. So a big part of the CarbonZ philosophy is we need to be pursuing emissions reduction as fast and far as possible. But secondary, we really need to be taking as much carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into native forests as we can.
Why have you put your emphasis into native forests and not fast-growing exotic trees?
Native forests are so critical to New Zealand's climate change and biodiversity response. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals says that we should be trying to restore 30% of every habitat by 2030, and the Canterbury Potocarp Forest, for example, is only at 2% of its original extent, which is just absolutely devastating. So there's massive amounts of native afforestation that I guess beyond climate change, beyond biodiversity, we just have a duty as custodians to restore that forest to at least 30% of its natural state. And that's the big one for me on why native forests, just because of the immense deforestation, destruction that's happened across New Zealand.
Who are the main beneficiaries or customers of CarbonZ?
So sheep and beef farms occupy 40% of New Zealand's landmass, which is a huge portion of New Zealand. And currently there's no incentive mechanism for sheep and beef farmers to access finance to facilitate restoration of native forests. So it's landowners across New Zealand, in particular sheep and beef farms, who have areas of marginal land on their property where they've got some stock in there. There's not a lot of active management happening at the moment, not a lot of financial reward coming from that bit of land, and that through stock exclusion, pest control, bit of supplementary planting, controlling of woody weed species, that they can unlock significant native forest restoration and therefore be the beneficiaries of this carbon credit income.
Why is additionality important, and how does CarbonZ account for it?
Additionality as it applies to voluntary carbon removals is super important, that this carbon sequestration wouldn't have otherwise happened unless that carbon payment was made. There's an enormous opportunity for New Zealand to facilitate restoration of native forests in our pre-90 native forests, and the critical mechanism to doing that is carbon credits from additional sequestration in pre-90 native forests. Voluntary carbon credits have more potential than almost any other mechanism to facilitate restoration at scale in New Zealand outside the ETS.
Isn't the scheme just allowing polluters to continue to pollute rather than reducing gross emissions?
Offsets work when they're highly priced and they're of high efficacy, of really high quality, because if a business has got this big cost for their emissions and they've got to go offset them, then they're more likely to go and reduce emissions in the first place. Offsets don't work if they're low cost and low quality. We've got to pull out as much carbon as possible from the atmosphere and simultaneously be cutting emissions as far and fast as possible. It's a political constraint, the fact that offsets invoke emissions complacency, not a nature complaint. You know, the planet wants us to pull this carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into native forests and reduce emissions, not one or the other.